1992, the bodies of these 6 people were discovered scattered across different locations. Several others were shot and somehow lived to tell the story. What investigators soon uncovered was almost impossible to believe. This nightmare didn't begin with greed or revenge, but with a 16-year-old girl who was bored and looking for excitement. One reckless decision set off a chain of violence that would shatter families, terrorize a city, and turn Christmas Day into the darkest holiday Dayton had ever known. Before we walk through the timeline of what happened, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. These stories matter, not for the shock value, but because they remind us of the lives lost and the communities forever changed. Every victim in this case deserves to be remembered. Dayton was a city familiar with struggle. By the early 90s, unemployment was high. Neighborhoods were fraying, and downtown had become a gathering place for young people with nowhere else to go. The Rust Belt was rusting. Factories that once employed thousands had shuttered. Families that had lived comfortably for generations now found themselves barely scraping by. And for teenagers caught in the middle of this economic collapse, the future looked bleak. Among them was a loose group of teenagers who called themselves the Downtown Posse. They spent their days at Courthouse Square, panhandling for change, sleeping in abandoned buildings, and drifting through a world that had largely given up on them. Some had been kicked out of their homes. Others had simply left, unable to cope with the chaos inside. They were estranged from their families, broke, and searching for something, anything, to fill the void. At the center of this group was Marvelous Keene, a 19-year-old who stood over 6 feet tall and had a reputation for being intimidating. His presence alone was enough to make people cross the street. But those who knew him before 1991 described someone very different. A good student, someone who stayed out of trouble, someone with potential. That changed when his older brother was killed during a robbery. Friends say the loss devastated him. He dropped out of school, withdrew from his family, and took on a darker, more volatile personality. The grief consumed him, and in its place grew something cold and dangerous. By his side was Laura Taylor, just 16 years old. She was known as the intellectual of the group, the one who pressured the others, who pushed for action when boredom set in. She was tough, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. Prosecutors would later describe her as one of the coldest people they had ever encountered, someone who seemed to lack any trace of empathy or remorse. Despite her age, she commanded respect and fear from the others. Rounding out the core members were DeMarcus Smith, 17, and his girlfriend Heather Matthews, 20. Smith was loyal to Keene and willing to do whatever it took to prove himself. Matthews, the oldest of the group, later claimed she participated out of peer pressure and a desperate need to belong. She wanted to be accepted, to be part of something, even if that something was unthinkable. Together, they had grown tired of scraping by. They wanted more. And on the morning of Christmas Eve, 1992, Laura Taylor made it clear she wasn't willing to wait any longer. According to later testimony, she began pressuring the others, telling them they needed to do something bigger. She was tired of begging for nickels and dimes. She wanted action. She wanted excitement. And she said something that would later be repeated in court, in news reports, and in the nightmares of those who heard it. Let's get some drama in our lives. The group settled on a plan that they would rob someone they knew. The target was Joseph Wilkerson, a 34-year-old man who was an acquaintance of Taylor's. The setup was simple. Taylor and Matthews would lure him with the promise of. Once inside his home, they would rob him. It was supposed to be quick, easy, and profitable. That afternoon, the 2 young women arrived at Wilkerson's house on the west side of Dayton. He let them in without hesitation. They pretended to undress, playing their roles convincingly. And then Matthews pulled a gun. Wilkerson, caught completely off guard, was ordered onto his bed. They bound him to the headboard with electrical cords, wrapping the wires tightly around his wrists. While Taylor and Matthews ransacked the house, Keene searched the garage. He found a .32 caliber Derringer pistol tucked away among the tools and boxes. What happened next, according to court testimony, was not part of the original plan. Keene returned to the bedroom, stood over Joseph Wilkerson, and shot him once in the chest. The sound echoed through the small house. Then Laura Taylor took the gun from his hand, placed it against Wilkerson's head, and fired again. The second shot was deliberate, calculated, final. The haul from the robbery was meager: a microwave, a small television, a curling iron, a blow dryer, and a telephone. The only thing of real value was Wilkerson's car. They covered his body with clothes and debris, leaving him tied to his own bed, and walked out the front door as if nothing had happened. For the next several days, they would use his home as a base, partying, sleeping, planning their next move, while Joseph Wilkerson's body lay undiscovered just a few feet away. By nightfall, the group was driving around in Wilkerson's stolen car, emboldened by what they had just done. The initial robbery had been successful in their eyes. No consequences, no immediate police response, just a car, some valuables, and a growing sense of invincibility. On Neal Avenue, they spotted a young woman using a payphone. Her name was Donita Gillette. She was 18 years old, a senior at Patterson Cooperative High School, and a mother to a 2-year-old daughter. That evening, she had bundled up against the cold, wearing a nice coat and a good pair of tennis shoes, items that would tragically seal her fate. Keene pulled up to the phone booth. According to witness statements and forensic evidence, he rolled down the window, looked directly at her, and said, "Merry Christmas." Then he fired 9 shots through the glass. The bullets shattered the booth. Donita was struck by 5 of them. She collapsed, her body falling halfway out of the booth onto the pavement. When police arrived, they found her lying in a pool of blood, surrounded by spent shell casings. The items taken from her: a coat, a pair of tennis shoes, and a backpack containing exactly 50 cents. Her body was discovered shortly after the shooting by officers responding to the 911 call. The pavement was covered in blood and brass casings, casings that would later prove critical in linking the crimes together. But at that moment, police had no idea this was just the beginning. They treated it as a tragic, isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong. They had no way of knowing that the same group would kill again within hours. The group returned to an apartment at 157 Yuma Place, a unit rented by Keene where they often stayed. It was a cramped space, cluttered with stolen goods, empty bottles, and the debris of transient lives. That night, Jeffrey Wright, Heather Matthews' ex-boyfriend, was also there. He had come by to hang out, unaware of what the group had just done. At some point during the night, tensions flared. An argument broke out between Wright and the others. The details of what sparked the confrontation remain unclear, but what happened next is documented in police records and witness testimony. DeMarcus Smith pulled out a gun and fired 4 shots into Wright's legs. The shots rang out in the small apartment, and Wright crumpled to the floor. Miraculously, Wright survived. Despite having 4 bullets lodged in his legs, he managed to drag himself out of the apartment and make it to a neighbor's home. He pounded on the door, bleeding and in shock, and begged them to call for help. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital. It was nothing short of a miracle that he lived. 2 other friends were present that night: Wendy Cottrell, 16, and Marvin Washington, 18. They had witnessed the attack on Wright, and now the core group, Keene, Taylor, Smith, and Matthews, began to worry. Could Cottrell and Washington be trusted to stay quiet? Would they go to the police? The 4 discussed it in hushed tones, weighing their options. For now, they decided to sleep on it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Christmas morning arrived, but there was no sense of celebration within the downtown posse. Instead, the group woke up and immediately began planning their next robbery. The target this time was Richard Maddox, Laura Taylor's 19-year-old ex-boyfriend. Maddox still lived with his parents and had no idea what Taylor had become in the months since they'd broken up. Taylor called him and convinced him to meet her, telling him they would go to a hotel together. It was a lie, of course, but Maddox believed her. He left his parents' home that morning, picked her up, and the two drove off together in his car. What he didn't know was that Keene, Smith, and Matthews were following close behind in a separate vehicle, ready to ambush him. But Maddox was more observant than they anticipated. He noticed the car tailing them. His instincts kicked in, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator, trying to escape. The chase was brief but frantic. And that's when Laura Taylor, sitting in the passenger seat beside him, made a split-second decision. In a rage-fueled panic, she pulled out a gun and pressed it directly against Maddox's right temple. She fired once, killing him instantly while he was still driving. The car veered wildly, crashing on Benton Avenue moments later. Taylor, realizing the danger, managed to bail out of the moving vehicle just before impact. She hit the pavement hard, but walked away with only minor injuries. When police found Maddox's body slumped over the steering wheel, it was immediately clear that he had been shot while operating the vehicle. The trajectory of the bullet, the lack of defensive wounds, the position of his body, all of it told the story. This wasn't an accident. This was an execution. That night, the group drove to an ATM on Salem Avenue. They parked nearby and waited, hoping to rob and kill the next person who came to withdraw cash. They sat there for hours, watching, waiting, but no one came. Eventually, exhausted and frustrated, they gave up. They pulled into a nearby parking lot, reclined the seats in Wilkerson's stolen car, and slept through the remainder of Christmas night. The morning after Christmas, the group stopped at a gas station. They spotted a woman airing up the tires on her Dodge Shadow. The decision was quick. They wanted another car. At gunpoint, they demanded she hand over the keys, but this woman did something different. Instead of freezing in fear, she ran. She bolted across the parking lot and didn't look back. The group, caught off guard by her sudden flight, let her go. She later reported the vehicle stolen to police, providing a description of the suspects. The group, undeterred, switched the license plates between the stolen Dodge and Wilkerson's car, hoping to confuse law enforcement. The group arrived at the Shortstop Mini Market on West 5th Street, a small family-owned grocery store tucked into a quiet neighborhood. Laura Taylor walked in first, pretending to browse. She was scoping out the place, checking for cameras, counting how many people were inside. Behind the counter was Sarah Abraham, a young mother of 3. That morning, before leaving for her shift, her daughter had handed her a hand-drawn Christmas picture, a small moment of love that Sarah had tucked into her pocket. Keene and Smith entered shortly after Taylor. Without warning, without a word, Keene raised his gun and fired 2 shots directly into Sarah's head. The sound was deafening in the small store. Customers screamed. Chaos erupted. They turned and fired at another customer, Jones Pettis, hitting him multiple times. Pettis collapsed but survived his injuries. Another customer, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson, narrowly escaped death by pretending to be hit. He dropped to the floor and lay completely still, holding his breath, praying they wouldn't check. Ironically, just moments before the shooting, Thompson had given Laura Taylor a nickel to help her buy a drink when she came up short at the counter. Sarah Abraham was rushed to Miami Valley Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. She clung on for 5 days, but ultimately her injuries were too severe. She died surrounded by her family, leaving behind 3 young children who would never see their mother again. The total profit from the robbery? $44. Forensic investigators later matched the shell casings found at the Shortstop Mini Market to those recovered at the phone booth on Neal Avenue. The same gun, the same killers. The pieces were starting to come together, but police still hadn't made the connection. After the grocery store shooting, the group circled back to their earlier concern: Wendy Cottrell and Marvin Washington. The 2 teenagers had witnessed the attack on Jeffrey Wright. They knew too much, and in the minds of Keene, Taylor, Smith, and Matthews, that made them liabilities. They called Cottrell and Washington, inviting them to hang out. They brought beer and wine, making it seem like a casual evening among friends. The six of them drove around for a while, laughing, talking, the tension hidden beneath the surface. Then Keene announced he needed to use the bathroom. He directed Smith to pull into a gravel yard on Richley Drive, a remote industrial area where the city stored road materials. When they arrived, Keene told everyone to get out of the car. Cottrell immediately sensed something was wrong. She froze in her seat, her instincts screaming at her to stay put. Keene reached in, grabbed her by the hair, and violently dragged her out of the vehicle. He and Smith ordered both teenagers to walk toward a large pile of dirt at the edge of the lot. Cottrell and Washington began pleading. They promised they hadn't told anyone. They swore they would never go to the police. Cottrell was crying, begging for her life. Washington stood beside her, equally terrified, his hands raised in surrender. It didn't matter. Their fate had already been decided. Keene placed the barrel of his gun inside Cottrell's mouth and pulled the trigger. At the exact same moment, Smith fired a shot into Washington's head at close range. Both teenagers collapsed instantly. The executions were quick, cold, and efficient. The group took Cottrell's shoes and a few gold chains from Washington's neck. Then they dragged the bodies to a different part of the gravel yard and left them there, partially hidden behind mounds of dirt and debris. About 72 hours after Joseph Wilkerson was killed, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was on routine patrol when he spotted a suspicious vehicle. A Dodge Shadow with license plates that looked out of place. Something about the car didn't sit right with him. He radioed in a check on the plates. The response came back quickly. The plates didn't belong to that vehicle. They were registered to a completely different car. Huber's suspicions were validated. He called for backup, and units closed in from all sides. He initiated a traffic stop expecting a routine auto theft arrest. But when officers approached the vehicle and looked inside, they found far more than they bargained for. There were guns, multiple firearms scattered throughout the car, ammunition, stolen goods, and 4 teenagers who looked far too calm for people caught in a stolen vehicle. At first, Laura Taylor ordered Keene to shoot at the police, but Keene, perhaps realizing the futility of a shootout, refused. He raised his hands and surrendered peacefully. Taylor and Matthews followed suit, raising their hands without resistance. DeMarcus Smith, however, tried to run. He bolted from the car and sprinted toward a nearby house. Officers pursued on foot and tackled him within minutes. At the time, Sergeant Huber and his fellow officers had no idea they'd just ended one of the worst crime sprees in Dayton's history. They thought they'd caught a group of car thieves. They had no idea about the bodies, the murders, the 72 hours of terror that had just come to an end. In the hours and days following the arrest, police began piecing together the timeline. The identical shell casings found at the phone booth on Neal Avenue and the shortstop mini market were the first major link. Ballistics confirmed they came from the same weapon. Dayton typically averaged fewer than 1 murder per week. Now, within 3 days, there were multiple victims, and the number kept growing. During interrogations, detectives were struck by the demeanor of the suspects. Laura Taylor, in particular, left a lasting impression. She was described as the most hardened person investigators had ever encountered. She showed no remorse, no emotion, no recognition of the gravity of what she had done. At one point during her interview, she urinated in her chair rather than ask to use the bathroom, a final act of defiance and contempt. The others cooperated to varying degrees. Heather Matthews broke down and admitted her role. DeMarcus Smith provided details about the timeline. Marvelous Keene remained relatively calm, answering questions, but offering little in the way of explanation. By the end of the interviews, the full scope of the crimes became clear. 6 people were dead. Several others had been shot and survived. And it had all started because a 16-year-old girl was bored. That evening, officers found Joseph Wilkerson's body at his home, still tied to the bed and covered in debris. The house reeked of death. It was clear he had been there for days. On December 27th, police received an anonymous tip, most likely from a local minister who had visited Laura Taylor in jail. The tip led them to a city-owned gravel dump on Richley Drive. There, partially hidden behind piles of dirt, they found the bodies of Wendy Cottrell and Marvin Washington. Doyle Burke, a homicide detective who worked the case, later said, "They were just killing people randomly for nothing, literally nothing. There was not even a motive. It was just for fun." Sergeant George Hammond added, "Once they tasted blood, they just couldn't stop." All four were charged with multiple counts of capital murder, aggravated robbery, and weapons offenses. Because Laura Taylor and DeMarcus Smith were juveniles at the time of the crimes, they were immune to the death penalty under Ohio law, a fact that enraged many in the community. Heather Matthews took a plea deal in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek execution. She admitted her role and expressed remorse, though many questioned the sincerity of her statements. Marvelous Keene's defense attorneys argued that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder following his brother's death in 1991. After his arrest, he sent a letter to a church he had attended as a child, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. But the court found that his trauma, while tragic, did not outweigh the severity of his crimes. Keene was convicted in 5 of the 6 killings and sentenced to death. He spent 17 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal. On July 21, 2009, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Marvelous Keene was executed by lethal injection. He refused to give any last words. Journalists gathered outside, photographing the somber scene. For the families of his victims, it was a moment of closure, but one that could never undo the pain. Nearly 30 years later, the remaining 3 members of the downtown posse are still in prison. They are now in their 40s, and parole appears highly unlikely. Laura Taylor is serving a life sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. She was responsible for pulling the trigger in 3 of the 6 murders. Reports from inside the prison suggest she has shown little change in demeanor over the years. DeMarcus Smith is serving life at the Mansfield Correctional Institution. He fired shots during 2 of the killings and has largely faded into obscurity behind bars. Heather Matthews is also serving life at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She has said her role was driven by peer pressure and a desperate desire to fit in. In interviews, she stated, "I wanted to be like them. I wanted to do what they were doing." While she was present during the killings, she never fired a weapon herself. She continues to maintain that she was a victim of circumstance, though prosecutors and victims' families strongly disagree. The Christmas killings remain one of the darkest chapters in Dayton's history. 2 books were written about the case by officers who worked the investigation, both released in the late 2000s. They provide insight into the investigation, the psychological profiles of the killers, and the impact on the community. The victims, Joseph Wilkerson, Danita Golette, Richard Maddox, Sarah Abraham, Wendy Cottrell, and Marvin Washington, deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as people. A young mother with a 2-year-old daughter, a high school senior with her whole life ahead of her, a grocery store clerk who received a hand-drawn Christmas card from her daughter that morning, 2 teenagers who were killed simply because they knew too much. Their lives were taken for nothing, no motive, no reason, just senseless violence driven by boredom and cruelty. If you found this story important, please like and subscribe. These cases matter, and remembering the victims matters even more.